The coroner handed me my daughter's severed finger with her promise ring still on it. "Strange," he whispered. "This kind of damage doesn't happen in brake failures." That's when I knew Sheriff Blake was lying. My twins Adrian and Ivy didn't die in an accident. They were murdered, and the man who killed them was standing right behind me, offering his condolences with blood still under his fingernails. Hit like, subscribe for more betrayal stories, and comment your city or country. My name is Victor Kane, and 48 hours ago, I believed justice existed in this world. I was wrong. The call came at 3:47 a.m. Sheriff Blake's voice was perfectly rehearsed, like he'd practiced the words. "Victor, there's been an accident. Your kids. I'm sorry, son. You need to come down to the hospital. 23 years of military service teaches you to control your breathing during crisis. But nothing prepares you for the sound of your heart shattering into a million pieces." My twins, Adrian and Ivy, were only 19. They were supposed to be home from college, safe in their beds. I drove through the empty streets of Millbrook County, my hands steady on the wheel despite the chaos in my chest. This town had been our sanctuary after I retired from Special Forces. Population 12,000. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where kids ride bikes without helmets and doors stay unlocked. The kind of place where sheriffs don't lie to grieving fathers. At the hospital, Blake was waiting with his perfectly pressed uniform and rehearsed sympathy. "Brake failure," he explained, showing me photos on his tablet. They went straight through the guardrail on Miller's Ridge. No skid marks, no signs they even tried to stop. But I was looking at something else. In the background of his crime scene photos, I could see tire marks. Fresh ones, going in the opposite direction. "Sheriff," I said quietly, "whose tire tracks are those?" His face changed for just a split second. A micro-expression I'd been trained to catch during interrogations in Afghanistan. Fear, guilt, calculation. "Probably from the tow truck," he said too quickly. "We had to pull the car up from the ravine." I nodded and thanked him. I played the grieving father perfectly. But inside, every instinct I'd developed hunting terrorists in 3 different countries was screaming the same thing. This man was lying to my face. The funeral was 3 days later. Half the town showed up. Blake gave a beautiful speech about how Adrian and Ivy were taken too soon, how brake failures were a tragic reminder to maintain our vehicles. His son Tristan stood beside him, looking appropriately somber in his expensive suit. But I noticed something no one else did. Tristan's hands were shaking, not from grief, from withdrawal. I'd seen that tremor 1,000 times in combat zones. The kid was coming down from something heavy. After the service, Blake's wife Amelia approached me with genuine tears in her eyes. "Victor, if there's anything we can do." "Actually," I said, "there is something. I'd like to see the accident report. And the car, if possible." Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Victor, you don't want to put yourself through that. The car it was bad." "I'm sure it was," I replied. "But I need to see it. For closure." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of grief, that would come later, in waves that would nearly drown me, but because every detail from the accident scene was wrong. The physics didn't match. The timeline didn't work. And Blake's story had more holes than a target after rifle practice. I opened my laptop and started researching. Miller's Ridge Road. Weather conditions that night. Traffic patterns. Security cameras in the area. That's when I found it. There was a gas station camera pointing toward the main road, about half a mile from the accident site. The owner, an old Vietnam vet named Felix, had been keeping the footage for insurance purposes. The next morning, I drove to Felix's station. We talked about the war, about losing people you love, about how sometimes the system fails the good guys. He understood without me having to explain. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. At 2:15 a.m., my kids' blue Honda drove past, heading toward Miller's Ridge. They were driving normally, carefully. No signs of brake problems. But at 2:43 a.m., a black pickup truck raced past the camera in the opposite direction, racing away from Miller's Ridge. The license plate was partially obscured, but I could make out enough. It belonged to Tristan Blake. The sheriff's son had been at Miller's Ridge Road when my children died. I sat in my truck outside the gas station, staring at the timestamp on Felix's security footage. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, surgical, the way they used to be when I had a target in my crosshairs. For the first time since the phone call that destroyed my world, I smiled. Sheriff Blake had no idea who he was dealing with. In Afghanistan, they called me the Angel of Death, not because I was reckless or brutal, but because I was patient, methodical. I could track a target for months, learning every detail of their life, every weakness, every fear. And then, when the moment was perfect, I would deliver justice with precision that left no doubt and no escape. Blake thought he was dealing with a broken father in a small town where his word was law. He was about to learn what happens when you kill the children of a man who spent 2 decades perfecting the art of war. The next morning, I drove to the impound yard where they were keeping my children's car. The attendant, a nervous kid named Mason, kept apologizing as he led me through rows of twisted metal and broken dreams. "It's in the back," he said quietly. "Sheriff Blake said you might come by." My Honda Civic sat under a tarp, crushed and mangled beyond recognition. But I wasn't looking at the obvious damage. I was looking for the details that would tell me the real story. I walked around the wreckage slowly, methodically. The front end was completely destroyed from the impact with the trees at the bottom of the ravine. But something was wrong with the rear bumper. There were scrape marks, paint transfer, fresh damage that had nothing to do with hitting trees. Someone had rammed them from behind. "Mason," I called out, "do you have the brake lines that were removed from this car?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff Blake took those for evidence. Said they'd be tested at the state lab." Of course he did. But Blake had made one mistake. He'd forgotten about the backup systems modern cars have. Every Honda since 2015 came equipped with an event data recorder, a black box that captured the final seconds before impact. "What about the EDR? The computer system?" Mason looked confused. "The what now?" "Never mind." I walked back to the rear of the car and knelt down, running my fingers along the crushed bumper. The paint transfer was silver. Tristan Blake drove a silver pickup truck. But I needed more than paint chips and tire tracks. I needed to understand the whole picture. Why would the sheriff's son want to hurt my kids? Adrian and Ivy were good students, never got in trouble, had no enemies that I knew of. That afternoon, I drove to the college campus where my twins had been studying. Preston University was 2 hours away, but they came home every weekend. I needed to know what their last weekend had been like. Their dorm supervisor, a kind woman named Ruby, met me in the lobby with red eyes and genuine grief. "Your children were special, Mr. Kane," she said. Adrian was studying criminal justice, and Ivy was in pre-law. They were both talking about working in law enforcement after graduation. Something cold settled in my stomach. Law enforcement? Oh yes. Adrian had been doing research on police corruption for his senior thesis. He was so excited about it. Said he'd found some really interesting cases right here in your county. The pieces were starting to fit together. Did he mention any specific cases? Ruby thought for a moment. He'd been interviewing families about suspicious deaths and accidents. Said there was a pattern, but he needed more evidence before he could prove anything. My blood ran cold. My son had been investigating corruption in Millbrook County. He'd been getting close to something, and someone had decided to silence him permanently. "Ruby, did Adrian keep his research here, or did he take it home?" "He took it with him last weekend. Had a whole box of files and interviews. Said he was going to show it to his father because his father would know what to do with it. They'd been coming to me. My children had discovered something dangerous, and they were bringing the evidence home to their dad, the ex-military man they trusted to help them fight the bad guys. They never made it. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing through possibilities. If Adrian had been investigating police corruption, and if that investigation had led to Sheriff Blake or his family, then the accident wasn't random. It was an execution. Back at my house, I searched Adrian's room methodically. It had been torn apart after the funeral. I'd assumed it was grief-driven destruction, but now I realized someone had been looking for something. In the back of his closet, behind a loose board I'd installed when he was 12 and wanted a secret hiding spot, I found what they'd missed. A single flash drive, labeled in Adrian's careful handwriting, insurance policy. I plugged it into my laptop with shaking hands. The files were explosive. Bank records, photographs, audio recordings, meeting transcripts. Adrian had been building a case for months, documenting a web of corruption that went all the way to the top of Millbrook County's power structure. Sheriff Blake wasn't just taking bribes. He was running protection for a drug operation that included his son Tristan, Mayor Colin Reeves, and Judge Dominic Hart. They'd been covering up overdoses, falsifying accident reports, and intimidating witnesses for years. But the most damning evidence was a recording Adrian had made just 3 days before he died. He'd somehow gotten audio of a meeting between Blake and his son. "Dad, those college kids were asking questions about the Morrison family. They know about the overdose we covered up." "What kind of questions?" "Smart questions." The girl kept asking why there was no autopsy. The boy wanted to see the police report. "They're not going to let this go. Then we make sure they can't ask any more questions." "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean, Tristan. Sometimes accidents happen, especially on dark, winding roads like Miller's Ridge." I listened to that recording 17 times, each word burning deeper into my soul. They planned it. My children weren't collateral damage in some drug operation. They were executed because they'd gotten too close to the truth. I made copies of everything and stored them in 3 different locations. Then I started planning. In Afghanistan, we had a saying, "Patience defeats power." Blake and his corrupt network had all the official power in this county. They controlled the police, the courts, and the local government. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd killed the children of a man who'd spent 23 years learning how to dismantle criminal organizations from the inside out. I wasn't going to storm in with guns blazing. That was what they'd expect from a grieving father. Instead, I was going to do what I did best: gather intelligence, identify weaknesses, and strike with surgical precision when they least expected it. The first step was understanding their operation completely. I needed to know who was involved, how the money flowed, where they kept their records, and most importantly, what they feared most. Over the next week, I began surveillance. I followed Blake's routine, mapped out Tristan's drug pickups, and identified the key players in their network. I used every skill I'd learned in military intelligence, every technique I'd mastered hunting high-value targets in hostile territory. But this time, it was personal. Late one night, as I sat in my truck across from Blake's house, watching him arrive home from what I knew was a meeting with his drug contacts, my phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello. Is this Victor Kane?" The voice was female, nervous, scared. "Who's asking?" "My name is Natalie Morrison. My brother died 6 months ago. The sheriff said it was an overdose, but I know it wasn't. I've been trying to find someone who would listen, and I heard your kids were asking questions about my brother before they died." My blood turned to ice. Another family, another cover-up, another piece of Blake's network of corruption and murder. "Natalie," I said quietly, "I think we need to talk." Natalie Morrison met me at the old diner on Highway 9, 20 miles outside Millbrook County. She was in her early 30s, blonde hair pulled back tight, eyes that had seen too much grief for someone so young. She slid into the booth across from me, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. "My brother Quinn wasn't a drug user," she said without preamble. "He was a paramedic, clean for 3 years after rehab. But Sheriff Blake found him dead in his apartment with a needle in his arm and called it an overdose." I studied the photographs she spread across the table. Crime scene photos, autopsy requests that were denied, toxicology reports that never came back from the lab. "Quinn had been asking questions too," Natalie continued, "about discrepancies in emergency calls, times when he'd respond to overdoses, but the sheriff's department would arrive first and wave him off. Said the victims were already dead, no need for medical intervention. How often did this happen? 6 times in 8 months. Always the same pattern. Anonymous 911 call, sheriff's department arrives first, victim pronounced dead at scene before paramedics could examine them. She pulled out a notebook filled with her brother's handwriting. Quinn started documenting everything. He thought someone was killing people and making it look like overdoses. The pieces clicked into place. Blake wasn't just covering up his son's drug dealing. He was eliminating potential witnesses and competitors. Anyone who got too close to their operation ended up dead from a convenient overdose. The night Quinn died, he called me. Natalie said, her voice breaking slightly. Said he had proof about the sheriff's department. That he was going to expose everything the next morning. He never got the chance. I photographed every document with my phone, memorizing names, dates, locations. Quinn Morrison had been thorough. His notes detailed a systematic operation where Blake's department controlled the entire drug trade in 3 counties. But there was something else in his research. Something that made my blood run cold. Natalie, this list of victims, do you recognize the pattern? She leaned over the table, studying her brother's notes. They're all young, college age or just out of college. And they all had connections to law enforcement families or were studying criminal justice. I pointed to specific entries. This kid's father was a state trooper. This girl was pre-law. This one was a journalism major investigating police misconduct. You think they're targeting anyone who might expose them? I think they're eliminating future threats. Kids who are smart enough and connected enough to bring them down. I met her eyes, just like my Adrian and Ivy. That night, I drove through Millbrook County's wealthiest neighborhood, studying the houses where Blake's network lived. Sheriff Blake's mansion sat on 5 acres, far too expensive for a county sheriff's salary. Mayor Colin Reeves owned 3 properties and drove a BMW. Judge Dominic Hart's house had a swimming pool and guest house. But it was Tristan Blake's lifestyle that caught my attention. For a 25-year-old with no official job, he lived remarkably well. Brand new truck, expensive clothes, and he was seen regularly at the county's most exclusive restaurant. I needed to get closer to their inner circle, but walking up and asking questions would get me killed faster than my children. I needed a different approach. The next morning, I called an old military contact who now worked private security in Atlanta. Within hours, he'd created a complete false identity for me. David Mitchell, recently retired from military contracting, looking to relocate somewhere quiet with good investment opportunities. The cover story was perfect. Rich enough to be interesting to corrupt officials, military background to explain my bearing and skills, but no local connections to make them suspicious. I rented a furnished house in the upscale part of town and began inserting myself into their social circles. The country club, the high-end restaurants, the charity events where Millbrook County's elite congratulated themselves on their civic virtue. It took 2 weeks, but eventually Sheriff Blake himself approached me at a fundraiser for the local hospital. Mr. Mitchell, isn't it? I'm Blake, County Sheriff. Heard you might be settling in our area permanently. That's the plan, I replied, shaking his hand and studying his face up close. This was the man who'd ordered my children's murder. It took every ounce of military discipline not to snap his neck right there. Millbrook seems like the kind of place where the right people look out for each other. His eyes lit up at the subtle suggestion. It absolutely is. We take care of our own here. Maybe we should have lunch sometime, talk about opportunities. I'd like that very much. 3 days later, I sat across from Blake at the Millbrook Country Club, listening to him explain how things really worked in his county. The thing about small towns, he said, cutting into his steak, is that official channels can be inefficient. Sometimes business needs to move faster than bureaucracy allows. I understand completely. In my previous work, flexibility was essential. Exactly. Now, a man with your background and resources might find certain collaborative arrangements beneficial. We have some ongoing enterprises that could use a partner with your skill set. He was recruiting me into his criminal organization. The arrogance was breathtaking. He was so confident in his power that he was trying to corrupt a federal agent's father while that agent's body was barely cold in the ground. What kind of enterprises? I asked, playing along. Blake glanced around the restaurant, then leaned closer. Import business. High profit margins, discrete operations. My son Tristan runs the day-to-day, but we're always looking for experienced hands. Sounds promising. When can I meet your son? Actually, he's here tonight. Tristan, the young man who approached our table, looked nothing like the grieving family friend from my children's funeral. His eyes were glassy from recent drug use, his movements jittery and aggressive. This was the person who'd murdered my twins and was now being handed control of a criminal empire. Dad, you didn't tell me we were meeting tonight. Tristan's voice carried an edge of paranoia that confirmed what I already suspected. He was using his own product. Tristan, meet David Mitchell. He's interested in joining our family business. Tristan studied me with unfocused eyes. You look familiar. Have we met before? My heart hammered against my ribs, but my expression remained neutral. I don't think so. I'm new in town. Huh. Must be my imagination. He sat down without invitation. So Dad says you want in on our operation. What makes you think you can handle our kind of work? The casual arrogance in his voice, discussing murder and drug dealing like it was selling insurance, confirmed everything I needed to know about these people. They felt completely untouchable. I've handled worse than anything you can imagine, I replied truthfully. Blake smiled. I believe you have. Tristan, why don't you show Mr. Mitchell around tomorrow night? Let him see how we operate. As I drove home from that dinner, one thing was crystal clear. Blake's network wasn't just a small-town corruption scheme. It was a sophisticated criminal organization with connections that went far beyond Millbrook County. The judge, the mayor, the sheriff, they were all pieces of something much larger. But they'd made one critical error in judgment. They thought I was just another potential recruit to their criminal enterprise. They had no idea they'd just invited the angel of death to join their family. The warehouse Tristan led me to that night sat on the outskirts of 3 counties, perfectly positioned for distribution. As we walked through rows of expensive cars and motorcycles, I counted at least 40 people working the operation. This wasn't some small-time drug dealing. This was a multi-million-dollar empire. We moved product through 7 states, Tristan bragged. His pupils dilated from whatever he'd taken before our meeting. Dad's contacts in law enforcement keep the heat off, and Uncle Colin handles the political side. Uncle Colin. Mayor Colin Reeves wasn't just an ally, he was family. The corruption ran deeper than I'd imagined. Impressive operation, I said, memorizing faces and license plates. How long have you been running things? Dad started small 15 years ago, just looking the other way for certain shipments. But when Uncle Colin got elected mayor and great-uncle Dominic became judge, we realized we could control the entire region. Great-uncle Dominic. Judge Dominic Hart wasn't just connected to Blake's family. He was Blake's uncle. 3 generations of the same family had systematically taken control of Millbrook County's power structure. Tristan led me to an office where several men were counting money and packaging drugs. In the corner, a young woman sat tied to a chair, her face swollen from recent beatings. Who's that? I asked, my training kicking in to assess the threat and potential rescue scenarios. Paige Williams. Her boyfriend was skimming from us. She's going to help us send a message. Tristan's casual tone made my blood freeze. I recognized the name from Adrian's research. Paige Williams was a nursing student whose boyfriend had died in a car accident 6 months ago. She'd been asking questions about the circumstances of his death. What kind of message? The permanent kind. Dad says we can't have people thinking they can steal from us or investigate our business. Tristan pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. One more overdose victim. Tragic how these young people get involved with drugs. I watched him prepare to murder an innocent woman the same way they'd murdered my children, the same way they'd been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened their empire. Every instinct screamed at me to stop him, to break his neck and free the girl. But I couldn't blow my cover. Not yet. Not when I was this close to understanding the full scope of their operation. Smart approach, I managed to say. Clean, no loose ends. Tristan smiled. Dad taught me well. He always says the best crimes look like accidents or natural causes. That's why we've never had a single murder conviction in this county. Because they controlled the sheriff, the judge, and the mayor. Because they decided what got investigated and what got buried. Because they'd built a perfect system where they could kill anyone who threatened them and face no consequences. How many people know about this operation? Just family and our most trusted associates. Maybe 20 people total. Everyone else thinks they're working legitimate security or transportation jobs. Tristan gestured around the warehouse. Most of these workers have no idea what they're really moving. 20 people. That was my target list. 20 corrupt officials, criminals, and murderers who had built their empire on the bodies of innocent victims. As Tristan prepared to inject Paige with a fatal overdose, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I let him do it. I watched a 20-year-old nursing student die, so I could maintain my cover and gather the evidence needed to bring down the entire organization. I told myself it was necessary, that saving her would mean dozens of other victims would never get justice. But standing there, watching the light fade from Paige Williams' eyes, I understood something fundamental about myself. I was no longer the same person who'd raised Adrian and Ivy. The man who'd taught them about justice and protecting the innocent had died with them on Miller's Ridge Road. What remained was something colder, more calculating. Something that could sacrifice one life to save many others. Something that could watch a young woman die and feel nothing but grim satisfaction that her murderer had just provided crucial evidence for his own destruction. After they disposed of Paige's body, another overdose victim, who would be found in her apartment the next morning, Tristan drove me to his second location, an abandoned farmhouse where they kept their records and held their most sensitive meetings. In the basement, filing cabinets contained 15 years of documentation. Bank records, police reports, court documents, photographs, and audio recordings. Blake's organization had kept meticulous records of every crime, every bribe, every cover-up. Dad's paranoid about security, Tristan explained, unlocking a fireproof safe. Says evidence is insurance. If anyone tries to betray us, we have enough dirt to bury them. The safe contained the crown jewels of their criminal enterprise. Names, dates, amounts, and methods. A complete roadmap of corruption that reached into state government, federal agencies, and multinational drug cartels. But the most valuable discovery was a leather-bound journal in Sheriff Blake's handwriting. 15 years of entries detailing every murder, every cover-up, every innocent person they'd eliminated to protect their empire, including a detailed plan for killing my children. Adrian and Ivy Kane are getting too close to the Morrison investigation. Tristan will handle it during their drive home from college. Make it look like break failure on Miller's Ridge. No witnesses, no evidence, no investigation. I photographed every page with a hidden camera, my hands steady despite the rage building in my chest. Blake had written about murdering my children the way someone might write about taking out the garbage. Casual, necessary, completely without remorse. As we left the farmhouse, Tristan seemed pleased with himself. So, Mitchell, what do you think? Ready to join the family business? More than ready, I replied truthfully. When do we start? Tomorrow night. Dad's got a shipment coming in from Atlanta, and we need extra security. Consider it your audition. Driving home that night, I reviewed everything I'd learned. Blake's criminal organization was larger and more sophisticated than anything I'd encountered in military operations. They had connections to major drug cartels, corrupt officials in multiple states, and enough firepower to wage a small war. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd show me everything. Every location, every face, every weakness in their seemingly perfect system. Now I had a choice to make. I could take the evidence to the FBI and hope that federal investigators could build a case strong enough to penetrate 15 years of corruption and cover-ups. Or I could do what I did best. I could hunt them down, one by one, and deliver the kind of justice that courtrooms couldn't provide. As I sat in my truck outside my empty house, staring at photographs of my murdered children, the decision was easier than it should have been. Blake wanted to see how I handled security work. He was about to learn what happens when you give weapons training to a man with nothing left to lose. I spent 3 weeks building multiple identities, each with their own digital footprints and paper trails. Anonymous tip lines, whistleblower accounts, concerned citizen reports, all leading back to different untraceable sources pointing toward Blake's operation. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning when FBI agent Harper received an overnight package containing copies of Blake's handwritten journal, financial records, and photographs from the warehouse operation. No return address, no fingerprints, no way to trace it back to me. Within hours, Blake's phone was ringing constantly. His superiors at the state level wanted explanations for suspicious activity reports that had mysteriously appeared on federal databases. I watched from across the street as Blake paced his office, barking orders at subordinates who suddenly seemed less confident in their protection. The veneer of untouchability was starting to crack. The second wave hit 3 days later. Fake witness testimonies began surfacing online, detailed accounts from former associates describing Blake's criminal activities. Social media posts, forum discussions, anonymous letters to newspapers, all carefully crafted to contain just enough truth to be believable, but impossible to trace to actual sources. "Someone's targeting us," Tristan told his father during a meeting I observed through long-range surveillance equipment. "These stories are too detailed, too accurate. It has to be someone on the inside." Blake's paranoia reached new heights. He ordered background checks on every associate, implemented new security protocols, and started varying his routines. But he couldn't escape the growing sense that invisible enemies were closing in from all sides. The psychological warfare was working perfectly. When criminals feel hunted, they make mistakes. On Friday night, Mayor Colin Reeves received a package at his home containing photographs of him accepting bribes, along with a note. "Your nephew killed innocent children. Justice is coming." Judge Dominic Hart found similar evidence in his chambers the next morning, with the addition of audio recordings of him taking money to fix court cases. By the weekend, Blake's entire network was fracturing. Associates were demanding meetings, asking questions, wondering if they should cut ties before federal investigations got serious. "Whoever's doing this knows everything about our operation," Blake told his inner circle during an emergency meeting at the farmhouse. "They have access to financial records, meeting locations, even our personal conversations." I smiled from my hidden position in the woods, listening through the surveillance equipment I planted weeks earlier. They were right to be afraid. The third wave was the most devastating. I began releasing information that turned them against each other. Bank records showing Tristan skimming money from his father's operation. Audio recordings of Mayor Reeves discussing eliminating Judge Hart if he became a liability. Financial documents proving Blake had been shortchanging his cartel connections. Within days, their perfect criminal family was at war with itself. Trust evaporated. Alliances crumbled. Everyone suspected everyone else of being the source of the leaks. But the masterstroke came when I anonymously sent Blake's own security footage to his drug cartel connections in Atlanta. Video evidence of Tristan stealing from shipments, along with a note suggesting Blake was planning to eliminate his cartel partners and take over their territory. The cartel's response was swift and brutal. 3 of Blake's warehouses were raided by heavily armed men who weren't interested in arrests. They wanted their money back, and they wanted Blake to understand the consequences of betrayal. "This is out of control," Blake told his wife Amelia during a heated argument in their kitchen. 15 years of building this empire, and someone's destroying it in 3 weeks. Maybe it's time to get out, Amelia replied. Take what money we can and disappear before this gets worse. We can't run. Too many people depend on us staying in power. If we leave, everyone we've protected will give us up to save themselves. Through hidden cameras I'd placed in their house, I watched Blake realize the truth. He was trapped in the empire he'd built. Too many enemies to run. Too much evidence to hide. Too many corrupt allies who would turn on him the moment his protection disappeared. The final psychological blow came when I sent copies of Blake's journal entries about murdering children to every parent in Millbrook County. Not through official channels that could be suppressed, but through social media, anonymous flyers, and midnight deliveries to doorsteps. By morning, the entire town knew their sheriff was a child killer. Parents pulled their kids from school. Businesses closed early. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's department demanding Blake's resignation and arrest. Dad, we need to do something, Tristan said during a panicked phone call I intercepted. People are calling for our heads. Some crazy father threatened to shoot me if he sees me in public. Let them threaten, Blake replied, though his voice carried strain. We control the law in this county. No one can touch us as long as we stick together. But they weren't sticking together anymore. Judge Hart had stopped answering Blake's calls. Mayor Reeves was considering resignation to avoid the growing federal attention. Corrupt officers were transferring to other departments or simply not showing up for work. Blake's empire wasn't just under attack. It was collapsing from within, exactly as I planned. The beauty of psychological warfare is that it doesn't require violence. It uses fear, paranoia, and distrust to make enemies destroy themselves. Blake had spent 15 years building a network based on corruption and murder. Now that same network was tearing itself apart, because criminals can never truly trust each other when survival is at stake. As I sat in my surveillance post, watching Blake pace his office like a caged animal, I felt the cold satisfaction of a hunter who'd successfully driven his prey into the open. Blake thought someone was hunting him. He was absolutely right. But he had no idea the hunter was someone whose children he'd murdered, someone with the patience and skills to destroy everything he'd built without leaving a single fingerprint or witness. The Angel of Death was just getting started. Blake's desperation reached its breaking point when FBI agent Harper announced a formal investigation into corruption in Millbrook County. 3 weeks of psychological warfare had backed him into a corner, and cornered animals do the most predictable thing. They attack. The attempt came on a Thursday night. I was returning to my safe house when I spotted the tail, 2 unmarked police cars following at a distance, trying to look casual. Blake had finally decided that David Mitchell needed to disappear permanently. I led them exactly where I wanted them to go, the old quarry outside town, isolated and perfect for what they thought would be a simple execution disguised as suicide. Blake himself stepped out of the lead car, along with 2 corrupt deputies I'd identified from surveillance footage. They thought they had cornered a frightened retiree who'd gotten too close to their operation. "Mr. Mitchell," Blake called out, his voice echoing across the empty quarry. "We need to talk." I stood at the edge of the cliff, hands visible, playing the part of a terrified man with nowhere to run. "Sheriff Blake, I was wondering when you'd figure out I wasn't who I claimed to be." "Smart man. Too smart for your own good." He drew his service weapon, flanked by his deputies. "See, we've had some problems lately. Anonymous tips, leaked information, federal attention. All starting right around the time you showed up in town. Interesting coincidence. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to write a suicide note confessing to harassment and stalking. Then you're going to jump off this cliff." Tragic story. Military veteran couldn't adjust to civilian life, became obsessed with local law enforcement, took his own life rather than face justice. I pulled out a notepad and pen, my hands shaking convincingly. "What should I write?" "Start with your real name. We know David Mitchell is fake." I wrote carefully, making sure they could see every word. My name is Victor Kane. I came to Millbrook County to investigate the murder of my children, Adrian and Ivy Kane. Blake's face went white. Behind him, his deputies exchanged nervous glances. You're the father, he whispered. I'm the father whose children you murdered because they discovered your drug operation. I looked up from the notepad, my expression no longer fearful. I'm also the man who's been systematically destroying your empire for the past 3 weeks. You son of a... Blake raised his gun, but I was already moving. The first deputy went down with a combat knife to the throat before Blake could finish his sentence. 23 years of special forces training don't disappear just because you're outnumbered. The second deputy managed to draw his weapon, but muscle memory from 1,000 combat engagements guided my movements. His shot went wide. Mine didn't. Blake stumbled backward, firing wildly, but I'd already rolled behind the concrete barrier at the quarry's edge. His bullets sparked off cement while I calculated angles and distances. You killed my children, I called out, my voice carrying across the quarry with deadly calm. Did you really think I'd let you walk away from that? You're outnumbered. More units are coming. He was lying. Blake was too paranoid to involve more people in a murder plot. This was supposed to be a quiet execution with minimal witnesses. I moved like a ghost, using shadows and terrain the way I'd been trained in Afghanistan. Blake spun in circles, firing at sounds and shadows, his panic making him sloppy. When I finally appeared behind him, pressing a knife to his throat, he was out of ammunition and out of options. Here's what's going to happen, I whispered in his ear. You're going to call off any backup that might be coming. Then you're going to help me stage a very convincing death scene. Using Blake's own plan against him, I staged my suicide with military precision. His gun, his bullets, blood from a shallow cut that looked fatal from a distance. I even left behind identification and a suicide note confessing to stalking law enforcement. Blake helped me arrange everything, motivated by the knife at his kidney and the promise that cooperation might let him live a few hours longer. People will investigate, he said as we positioned my body at the bottom of the quarry. The FBI, state police, let them investigate. They'll find exactly what you wanted them to find. A disturbed veteran who took his own life after harassing local officials. I zip-tied Blake's hands behind his back and dragged him to a cave system I discovered during reconnaissance. Deep enough to muffle sound, hidden enough that his body wouldn't be found for months. You can't just disappear me, Blake protested. My wife will report me missing. My department will search. Your department thinks you're investigating my suicide. Your wife thinks you're working late. By the time anyone realizes you're missing, there will be logical explanations for everything. In the cave, I set up the equipment I prepared for this moment. Lights, cameras, recording devices. If Blake was going to die, his death would serve a purpose. You're going to tell me everything, I explained, showing him the instruments I'd brought. Every murder, every cover-up, every innocent person you've killed. Names, dates, methods. Complete confessions for crimes that will never see a courtroom. I'm not telling you anything. Sheriff, you spent 15 years perfecting the art of making people disappear. I spent 23 years perfecting the art of making people talk. It took 6 hours to extract complete confessions covering 15 years of corruption and murder. Blake told me about the Morrison family, the Williams girl, 3 other families whose children had been eliminated for asking too many questions. 47 people. That's how many innocent victims had died to protect Blake's empire. When he finished talking, Blake looked up with desperate eyes. Now what? You got your confessions. You got your revenge. What happens to me? I studied the man who'd murdered my children, who'd built an empire on innocent blood, who'd spent decades believing he was untouchable. You die, I said simply. But not quickly, not mercifully. You're going to experience exactly what you put 47 families through. I left him in that cave, alive but helpless, with enough food and water to survive for weeks. Long enough to understand true hopelessness. long enough to go slowly insane from isolation and fear, long enough to die the way his victims had died, abandoned, forgotten, with no hope of rescue. 3 days later, local news reported the tragic suicide of David Mitchell, a disturbed military veteran who'd been stalking Sheriff Blake. The sheriff himself had discovered the body and was cooperating fully with federal investigators. Except Sheriff Blake was already dead in a cave miles from anywhere, and the man who'd been hunting his criminal empire had just become invisible. Victor Kane was officially deceased. David Mitchell never existed. But the Angel of Death was just beginning his real work. Operating from the shadows, with unlimited resources stolen from Blake's operation and complete freedom to move without legal constraints, I prepared to systematically dismantle everything Blake had built. The dead can accomplish things the living never could. Being dead gave me advantages I'd never had as a living man. No legal constraints, no official oversight, no accountability to anyone except the ghosts of 47 innocent victims who demanded justice. Within 24 hours of my staged suicide, I began the systematic destruction of Blake's empire from the shadows. The financial assault came first. Using Blake's own banking credentials and passwords, extracted during his final interrogation, I initiated wire transfers that scattered the organization's money across dozens of untraceable accounts. $15 million in drug proceeds vanished overnight, leaving Tristan's operation unable to pay suppliers, employees, or protection money. Judge Dominic Hart was the first domino to fall. I anonymously delivered audio recordings of him accepting bribes to the State Judicial Review Board, along with financial records showing unexplained wealth far beyond his official salary. By Friday morning, federal marshals were escorting him from his chambers in handcuffs. Without Hart's protection, cases that had been buried for years suddenly found new life. Families of victims began receiving anonymous packages containing evidence of cover-ups, suppressed investigations, and falsified reports. The courthouse was flooded with lawsuits and demands for justice that could no longer be quietly dismissed. Mayor Colin Reeves tried to distance himself from his nephew's crumbling empire, but I'd spent weeks documenting his involvement. IRS agents arrived at his office with warrants for tax evasion, money laundering, and racketeering charges. His resignation letter was accepted before he could finish typing it. Tristan was spiraling without his father's guidance and protection. Blake had been missing for 5 days, officially investigating David Mitchell's suicide, but I watched through surveillance cameras as Tristan called his father's phone dozens of times without getting an answer. "Where is he?" Tristan screamed at his mother during a heated argument in their kitchen. Dad wouldn't just disappear, not with everything falling apart. Amelia Blake was asking the same questions, but her husband's department had logical explanations. Sheriff Blake was coordinating with federal investigators, following leads on David Mitchell's background, ensuring all evidence was properly collected and processed. Meanwhile, I was using those same federal investigators to dismantle the empire from within. FBI agent Harper received a new package every morning. Search warrants for specific addresses, bank account numbers for properties purchased with drug money, names and photos of corrupt officers who'd been taking protection payments. The federal investigation that had started with anonymous tips was now a full-scale RICO operation targeting organized crime throughout 3 counties. But my most devastating weapon was turning Blake's criminal network against itself. Using encrypted communications systems I'd learned to operate during military intelligence work, I sent messages to Blake's cartel connections in Atlanta. "Blake disappeared with your money. His son is planning to eliminate all witnesses. Protect yourselves." The cartel's response was swift and brutal. Tristan's drug warehouses were hit by professional criminals who weren't interested in arrests or evidence. They wanted blood, money, and revenge for what they believed was Blake's betrayal. Within a week, Tristan had lost his supply chain, his distribution network, and half his enforcers. The empire that had taken 15 years to build was crumbling in real time. I watched it all from my hidden base of operations, an abandoned farmhouse I'd purchased using Blake's stolen money. Multiple identities, unlimited resources, and the freedom that comes from being officially dead. The psychological pressure was breaking everyone who'd been part of Blake's network. Deputy Logan Hayes, who'd helped cover up the Morrison murder, walked into FBI headquarters and confessed to everything in exchange for witness protection. He was terrified that whoever had killed his corrupt colleagues would come for him next. Court clerk Natalie Foster, who'd falsified records for Judge Hart, provided evidence of dozens of fixed cases in exchange for immunity. She'd received anonymous messages suggesting her children might suffer accidents if she didn't cooperate with federal investigators. Detective Quinn Morrison, brother of the murdered paramedic, came forward with evidence he'd been forced to suppress for years. Blake's death threats no longer carried weight when Blake himself had vanished without explanation. Each confession led to more evidence, more arrests, more dominoes falling throughout the network. But the masterpiece of destruction was psychological. I began leaving messages for Tristan in places only he would find them. His bedroom, his car, his private office. Simple notes that said, "Your father is dead. You're next." Security cameras I'd secretly installed captured his growing paranoia. He hired bodyguards, changed locations constantly, armed himself with multiple weapons. But you can't fight an enemy you can't see, especially when that enemy knows everything about your operation. The final stroke came when I sent Tristan a package containing his father's sheriff's badge, along with a photo of Blake's body in the cave where I'd left him to die. "Stop looking for your father," the note read. "He found exactly what he deserved. Confess your crimes to the FBI or join him." Through surveillance equipment, I watched Tristan collapse when he opened that package. The golden boy who'd murdered my children was sobbing uncontrollably, calling his mother, begging her to help him escape a nightmare that had no end. "We have to run," he told Amelia through tears. "Dad's dead. Someone killed him, and they're coming for all of us." But there was nowhere to run. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their assets were under federal investigation. Their criminal network was either dead, arrested, or cooperating with prosecutors. Most importantly, they were being hunted by someone who had unlimited resources, military training, and nothing left to lose. The empire Blake had built on the graves of innocent children was now nothing but rubble and fear. And I was just getting started. From the shadows, I prepared the final phases of justice. Not just for Blake's organization, but for every corrupt official, every criminal associate, every person who'd helped build an empire of murder and cover-ups. The dead don't sleep. The dead don't forgive. The dead don't stop until justice is complete. The angel of death was keeping his promise to 47 innocent victims. Tristan's breaking point came on a rain-soaked Tuesday night when he found his father's severed finger on his pillow, still wearing Blake's wedding ring. The note attached was simple: 24 hours to confess, or your mother receives the same package. I watched through hidden cameras as he vomited violently, then collapsed against his bedroom wall, hyperventilating. The golden boy who'd casually murdered college students was now a trembling wreck, destroyed by the same terror he'd inflicted on others. "Mom!" he screamed, stumbling down the hallway. "Mom, we have to leave. Right now." Amelia Blake emerged from her husband's study, where she'd been going through financial records, trying to understand why federal agents were freezing their accounts. When she saw her son's face, her maternal instincts overrode everything else. "Tristan, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Dad's dead. Someone killed him. They sent me." He couldn't finish the sentence, just handed her the bloody finger and collapsed into her arms. Amelia's scream echoed through the house as she recognized her husband's wedding ring. But what I saw in her eyes wasn't just grief, it was relief. Relief that the nightmare was finally ending. Through surveillance microphones, I heard their conversation as Tristan sobbed against his mother's shoulder. We have to run, he kept repeating. Get out of the country. Hide somewhere they can't find us. Who, Tristan? Who's doing this? The father. Victor Kane. The guy whose kid's dad and I killed. He's not dead. That suicide was fake. He's been hunting us this whole time. Amelia pulled back, staring at her son with dawning horror. You killed children? They were going to expose everything. Dad said we had to eliminate the threat. For the first time, Amelia Blake heard the complete truth about what her husband and son had become. Not just corrupt cops taking bribes, but cold-blooded murderers who'd built an empire on innocent blood. How many? She whispered. Tristan couldn't meet her eyes. I don't know. Dad kept count. Dozens, maybe more. Anyone who got too close to our operation. I watched Amelia's world collapse as she processed years of willful blindness. The expensive house, the luxury cars, the private schools, all paid for with money earned by murdering children. I can't be part of this anymore, she said, pushing away from her son. This has to stop. Mom, please. We can disappear. Start over somewhere else. But Amelia was already walking toward the phone. No more running. No more lies. If your father is dead, then this nightmare ends here. Tristan grabbed her arm desperately. You don't understand. This guy isn't going to stop. He won't be satisfied until we're all dead. Maybe we deserve to be dead. Those words, spoken by Blake's own wife, sealed Tristan's psychological destruction. His last ally, his final source of support, had abandoned him to face justice alone. Over the next hour, I watched Tristan spiral into complete mental collapse. He destroyed furniture, screamed at shadows, fired his gun at imaginary threats. The psychological pressure had finally broken his mind completely. But it was Amelia's phone call that changed everything. She didn't call the police or the FBI. She called the number I'd left in one of my anonymous packages, a secure line that would reach the ghost of Victor Kane. This is Amelia Blake, she said when I answered. I know you're listening. I know you're watching. I want to help you finish this. Through encrypted voice modulation, I responded carefully. Why would you help me destroy your own family? Because they're not my family anymore. They're monsters. And I've been enabling monsters for 15 years by pretending not to see what they really were. What are you offering? Everything. Bank records, meeting locations, evidence Blake hid from even his closest associates. I know where he kept his insurance files, documentation of every crime, every cover-up, every murder. This was unexpected. Blake's widow was offering to become my inside informant, providing access to evidence I couldn't obtain through surveillance or theft. What do you want in return? I want my son to survive this. Not escape justice. He needs to pay for what he's done. But I want him alive to face trial rather than dead in some cave like his father. I considered her proposal. Amelia Blake could provide the final pieces needed to completely expose the corruption network and ensure convictions that would stick in federal court. Your son murdered my children. I know. And if I could bring Adrian and Ivy back by sacrificing my own son, I would. But I can't. All I can do is help you ensure this never happens to another family. Her voice broke with genuine remorse, the first real emotion I'd heard from anyone in Blake's family since this began. There's a safe in Blake's private study, she continued, behind the false wall. The combination is 0419, Adrian and Ivy's birthday. He used their death date as his password, like some kind of sick trophy. The casual cruelty of that detail, using my children's birthday to protect evidence of their murder, nearly broke my own composure. I'll be in touch, I said, ending the call. Within an hour, Amelia had provided detailed layouts of Blake's hidden evidence vault, financial records showing payments to corrupt officials across 3 states, and audio recordings Blake had made of his criminal associates as insurance against betrayal. But her most valuable contribution was real-time intelligence about Tristan's mental state and location. He's planning something desperate, she reported during our second conversation, talking about taking hostages, forcing a confrontation with federal agents. He wants to go out in a blaze of glory rather than face trial. Can you stop him? I'm trying. But he's not listening to me anymore. He's completely lost touch with reality. Through surveillance cameras, I watched Tristan preparing for his final stand. Weapons, explosives, tactical gear. He was planning to turn his mother's house into a fortress and fight until federal agents killed him. But I had different plans for Blake's son. The boy who'd murdered my children wasn't going to escape justice through suicide by cop. He was going to face trial, conviction, and life in federal prison where Blake's enemies would ensure his remaining years were as miserable as possible. Justice required that he live with the consequences of his crimes, not escape them through death. It was time for the angel of death to make his final move. The federal sting operation began at dawn on Friday morning, orchestrated by a ghost who'd spent months learning every detail of Blake's criminal empire. FBI agent Harper received her final anonymous package containing blueprints of Tristan's defensive positions, his weapons cache locations, and a detailed plan for his capture. What she didn't know was that the anonymous informant was positioning himself to be the invisible puppet master of Blake's final destruction. I watched from a concealed position as federal agents surrounded the Blake mansion. Tristan had barricaded himself inside with enough weapons to hold off a small army, but his mother had already disabled his escape routes and sabotaged his defensive preparations. Tristan Blake, this is the FBI, Agent Harper's voice echoed through the morning air. The house is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible. Through surveillance cameras I'd hidden inside the house, I watched Tristan's final meltdown. He was firing wildly at shadows, screaming at imaginary enemies, completely disconnected from reality. They're not real, he shouted to his mother, who was trying to calm him down. Dad's still alive. This is all some kind of test. But Amelia knew better. She'd seen her husband's severed finger, heard the detailed confessions I'd extracted from Blake before his death. Her family's empire was built on 47 graves, and the reckoning had finally arrived. Tristan, please, she begged, trying to take the assault rifle from his shaking hands. This has to end. Your father is dead. The FBI has evidence of everything. Fighting will only make it worse. I'm not going to prison. I'm not going to rot in some cell while Dad's killers walk free. That's when I made my move. Using skills perfected during hostage rescue operations in Afghanistan, I infiltrated the house through routes Amelia had left unguarded. Tristan never saw me coming. The tranquilizer dart hit him in the neck before he could turn around. Military-grade sedatives designed to drop a target without permanent damage. Within seconds, Blake's son was unconscious on the floor. Amelia stared at me with a mixture of fear and relief. This was the first time she'd seen the ghost who'd been hunting her family, the father whose children her husband had murdered. Victor Kane, she whispered. Mrs. Blake. I secured Tristan's weapons and signaled the FBI through predetermined codes. Your son will live to face trial. That's more mercy than he showed my children. I know. And I know you could have killed us all. Thank you for choosing justice over revenge. Through the house's intercom system, I contacted Agent Harper directly. This is Victor Kane. Tristan Blake is secured and unconscious. No injuries, no resistance. I'm coming out with Mrs. Blake to surrender myself. The FBI's response was immediate confusion. Victor Kane was supposed to be dead, suicide by jumping from Miller's Ridge quarry weeks ago. But as I walked out of the Blake mansion with my hands visible, Agent Harper was already putting together the pieces. The mysterious anonymous informant who'd provided perfect intelligence. The systematic destruction of Blake's criminal network. The psychological warfare that had turned criminals against each other. You've been dead for 3 weeks, she said as federal agents surrounded me with weapons drawn. Death was temporary. Justice is permanent. As they processed my surrender, I provided Agent Harper with the final revelations that would ensure Blake's entire network faced federal prosecution. I'm not just Victor Kane, father of murdered children, I told her during the initial interrogation. I'm Federal Agent Victor Kane, deep cover investigator for the Department of Justice's Public Corruption Unit. The shock on her face was worth 3 weeks of maintaining my cover story. I was assigned to investigate reports of systematic corruption in Millbrook County 18 months ago. My children's murder wasn't random. It was Blake eliminating a federal agent's family to protect his empire. The evidence files I prepared told the complete story. My official federal credentials, sealed orders from Washington, documentation of the investigation that had brought me to Millbrook County under the David Mitchell identity. Blake didn't just kill my children, I continued. He killed the family of a federal investigator who was already building a case against him. Their deaths gave me legal authority to use any means necessary to complete the investigation. Agent Harper reviewed my federal identification with growing amazement. You're telling me this entire operation, the psychological warfare, the systematic destruction of Blake's network, even your staged death, was an authorized federal investigation? Authorized and documented. Every action I took was within the parameters of deep cover operations targeting organized crime. The beauty of the revelation was its complete believability. Federal agents had used similar tactics against organized crime for decades. My military background and investigative credentials made the cover story ironclad. But the real masterpiece was the legal framework I created. Because I was a federal agent conducting an authorized investigation, every piece of evidence I'd gathered was admissible in court. Every confession I'd extracted, every document I'd obtained, every recording I'd made, all of it could be used to prosecute Blake's entire criminal network. Blake himself was dead, but his empire would face complete legal destruction. Judge Dominic Hart. Life sentence for racketeering, murder conspiracy, and corruption. Mayor Colin Reeves. 25 years for money laundering and criminal conspiracy. Tristan Blake. Life without parole for multiple counts of first-degree murder. Dozens of corrupt officers, court officials, and criminal associates. Federal prosecution under RICO statutes with sentences ranging from 10 years to life. The systematic elimination of 47 innocent victims. I told Agent Harper as she processed the scope of Blake's crimes. Every death documented, every cover-up exposed, every corrupt official identified. As federal agents led me away for debriefing and official processing, I felt the satisfaction of a mission completed with perfect precision. Blake's empire was destroyed. His criminals were facing justice. His victims' families would finally have answers and closure. My children's murderers would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, where Blake's criminal enemies would ensure their suffering matched the pain they'd inflicted on innocent families. The angel of death had delivered perfect justice through legal channels, ensuring that evil faced consequences that courtrooms could enforce and society could accept. Justice for Adrian and Ivy Kane was finally complete. 6 months later, I walked into the federal courthouse in Atlanta as the star witness in the largest corruption trial in Georgia's history. The media called it the Millbrook Massacre, not because of violence, but because of how completely we'd dismantled 15 years of systematic criminal enterprise. Tristan Blake sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of someone who'd lost everything. His lawyers had tried every possible defense, but the evidence was overwhelming and ironclad. Judge Patricia Westbrook called the court to order as I approached the witness stand. The packed courtroom included families of 47 victims, federal agents, reporters, and curious citizens who wanted to see the man who'd brought down an empire from beyond the grave. Please state your name for the record, the federal prosecutor requested. Federal Agent Victor Kane, badge number 7439, Department of Justice Public Corruption Unit. The revelation still sent shockwaves through people hearing it for the first time. The grieving father who'd supposedly committed suicide was actually a deep-cover federal investigator who'd used his own tragedy to expose the largest criminal conspiracy in the region's history. Agent Kane, can you explain your assignment in Millbrook County? 18 months ago, the Department of Justice received reports of systematic corruption involving law enforcement, judicial officials, and elected leaders. I was assigned to investigate using deep cover identity as David Mitchell, a retired military contractor seeking relocation opportunities. I described the months of surveillance, evidence gathering, and relationship building that had preceded my children's murder. How Blake's organization had been under federal investigation long before they decided to eliminate what they thought was a potential threat. The irony, I testified, is that Adrian and Ivy weren't investigating Blake's corruption as part of any official capacity. They were college students doing research for academic projects. Blake killed the children of the federal agent who was already building a case against him. Defense attorney Mason Phillips tried to challenge my methods during cross-examination. Agent Kane, isn't it true that you tortured and murdered Sheriff Blake outside the bounds of legal authority? Blake died resisting federal investigation. His death occurred during the lawful execution of my duties as an undercover agent investigating organized crime. It wasn't entirely true, but it was legally defensible. Blake had died during a federal investigation, and I had been operating under broad authority granted for deep cover operations against criminal organizations. And the psychological warfare you employed against defendants? Standard investigative techniques for dismantling criminal enterprises, creating distrust among co-conspirators, applying pressure to encourage cooperation with federal authorities, and gathering evidence through legally authorized surveillance operations. Every answer was carefully crafted to fit within federal guidelines for undercover operations. My military background, federal credentials, and the scope of Blake's criminal enterprise provided legal justification for methods that might otherwise be questionable. The prosecution's case was devastating in its completeness. Audio recordings of Blake and Tristan planning my children's murder. Financial records showing 15 years of criminal proceeds. Witness testimony from victims' families who'd been terrorized into silence. Physical evidence linking defendants to dozens of unsolved deaths. But the most powerful moment came when I described finding my children's bodies. Adrian and Ivy Kane were 19 years old, honor students, volunteers at local charities, planning careers in public service. They died because they asked questions that threatened a criminal empire built on innocent blood. The courtroom was silent as I detailed their final weekend, their research into police corruption, their excitement about bringing evidence to their father who they trusted to help them fight injustice. They never made it home. Sheriff Blake and his son Tristan murdered them on Miller's Ridge Road, then covered up their deaths as a mechanical accident. My children died believing their father would get justice for them. I looked directly at Tristan as I continued. They were right. When the defense rested, Judge Westbrook addressed the defendants directly. In 30 years on the federal bench, I have never seen a criminal conspiracy of this scope and brutality. 47 innocent victims, including children, eliminated to protect a drug empire that generated over $50 million in illegal proceeds. The verdicts came after 6 hours of jury deliberation. Tristan Blake, guilty on all counts. Life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Judge Dominic Hart, guilty of racketeering and murder conspiracy. Life sentence. Mayor Colin Reeves, guilty of money laundering and criminal conspiracy. 25 years. 17 other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 years to life, dismantling Blake's entire criminal network in a single day. As court officers led Tristan away in shackles, he looked back at me with pure hatred. "This isn't justice," he snarled. "This is revenge." "No," I replied calmly. "Revenge would have been leaving you in that cave with your father. This is justice." Outside the courthouse, Agent Harper joined me as reporters shouted questions about the investigation. "How does it feel to have closure?" she asked. I thought about Adrian and Ivy, about the 45 other families who'd finally received answers about their murdered children, about the systematic evil that had been exposed and destroyed. It feels like my children can finally rest in peace, I said. And like the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to work. The federal investigation had resulted in the largest criminal asset forfeiture in Georgia history. Over $60 million recovered and distributed to victims' families. Complete reform of law enforcement in 3 counties. New oversight procedures to prevent future corruption. Most importantly, 47 families finally had justice for their murdered loved ones. As I walked away from the courthouse, I carried the knowledge that Adrian and Ivy's deaths had ultimately saved hundreds of future victims from Blake's criminal empire. Their father had kept his promise. Evil had faced consequences. Justice had prevailed. The angel of death had completed his mission. 5 years after the Millbrook trials, I stood at Adrian and Ivy's grave on a quiet Sunday morning, placing fresh flowers on the headstones that now read, "Beloved children who exposed corruption and saved countless lives." The cemetery was peaceful, surrounded by oak trees my twins had climbed as children. But today wasn't just about mourning. It was about celebrating the legacy their deaths had created. In the 5 years since Blake's empire collapsed, federal reforms had transformed law enforcement across 7 states. The Millbrook Protocol, named after my children's case, now required federal oversight for any suspicious deaths involving families connected to law enforcement or criminal justice. 43 families had received financial settlements from recovered criminal assets. College scholarships had been established in Adrian and Ivy's names for students pursuing careers in public service and criminal justice reform. Most importantly, the systematic corruption that had killed 47 innocent people could never happen again. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Harper. "Victor, we've got another case. Small town in Alabama, showing the same patterns Blake used. Interested in going undercover again?" I smiled, pocketing the phone without answering immediately. The angel of death had found his true calling, not as an instrument of revenge, but as a guardian protecting innocent families from the kind of evil that had destroyed mine. But there was something else I needed to do first. At the Millbrook Community Center, I addressed a packed auditorium filled with families of Blake's victims. These monthly gatherings had become healing sessions where survivors supported each other and worked to prevent future tragedies. Today marks 5 years since justice was served. I began, looking out at faces that had transformed from grief-stricken to determined. Our children didn't die in vain. Their deaths exposed a cancer that had been growing in our community for 15 years. Natalie Morrison, Quinn's sister, now ran a foundation providing support to families of victims of police corruption. "Victor, what's next for the federal task force?" "We've identified 17 other communities with suspicious patterns similar to what Blake was doing here. The work continues until every corrupt network is exposed and dismantled." After the meeting, I walked through downtown Millbrook, a community that had been transformed by facing its darkest truths. New leadership, transparent government, and citizens who would never again remain silent when evil disguised itself as authority. My children had wanted careers in law enforcement to protect innocent people. Through their deaths, they'd accomplished more than any single career could have achieved. As the sun set over Miller's Ridge Road, now renamed Adrian and Ivy Memorial Highway, I reflected on the journey from devastating loss to systematic justice. Blake's empire, completely destroyed. Criminal network, dismantled with life sentences for all major players. Corruption, exposed and reformed through federal oversight. Victims' families, compensated and supported through ongoing programs. Future prevention, established through the Millbrook Protocol and federal task forces. My children's legacy, permanent protection for countless innocent families. The angel of death had evolved from an instrument of personal vengeance into a guardian of justice who would spend the rest of his life ensuring no other parent would endure what I'd experienced. Justice wasn't just about punishing evil. It was about preventing evil from taking root again. As I prepared to leave Millbrook for my next assignment, I had one final conversation with the ghosts of my children. Adrian, Ivy, your research saved hundreds of lives. Your courage exposed corruption that could have continued for decades. Your deaths weren't meaningless. They were the beginning of justice that will protect families forever. Standing at their graves one last time, I made a promise that would guide the rest of my life. I'll keep fighting the battles you would have fought. I'll protect the innocent you would have protected. Your father will make sure your legacy never dies. The angel of death walked away from Millbrook County that night, but Victor Kane, federal agent, father, and guardian of justice, carried the memory of his children into every future battle against corruption and evil. Their story had ended in tragedy, but their legacy would live forever in every life saved, every criminal prosecuted, and every family protected from the kind of systematic evil that had once thrived in the shadows. Justice for Adrian and Ivy Kane was complete, but their father's mission to protect others would never end. Some angels watch over the innocent from heaven. Others hunt evil on earth, ensuring justice prevails for every family that faces darkness. The angel of death would never rest until evil had nowhere left to hide. Story complete now. Let me ask you something that's been on my mind throughout this entire journey of justice and revenge. What drives a parent to choose between personal vengeance and systematic justice when their children are murdered by those sworn to protect them? And here's what I really want to know from all of you watching. Please tell me in the comments where you're watching from around the world. I love connecting with viewers from different countries and cultures. If this story of corruption, revenge, and ultimate justice moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more intense thriller and revenge stories. Your support helps me bring you these deep, emotional narratives that explore the darkest corners of human nature and the light of justice that can emerge from tragedy. But most importantly, I want to hear from you in the comments. What types of stories do you want to hear next? Military revenge tales? Family betrayal stories? Corporate corruption thrillers? Police procedural mysteries? Let me know what themes and storylines captivate you most, and I'll craft those exact stories for future episodes. Your feedback shapes every story I tell, so please share what kind of thrilling, emotional narratives you're passionate about hearing. Until we meet again in the next epic revenge story, stay safe and remember, justice may be delayed, but it's never truly denied.